Hey Coyote fans, by now you've heard the news of USD deciding to opt into the House settlement. This has been an ongoing thing for months, and we've heard bits and pieces about the House settlement, and I know everybody's still trying to wrap their brain around this entire thing because it has been quite the roller coaster, and I know it has been for you. You make this decision. Let's start with why. Why now? I mean, we've talked about it before, and we're not opting in. We're going to press forward with how we are. What changed? Why is now the right time?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for us, John, was just initially when they talked about the settlement terms, there was no exceptions for grandfathering in rosters. And so what that meant for us, if we did opt in, was we would essentially be immediately in a position to cut at least 50 student athletes. I think it was 52 was the math that we did. So every sport kind of has a roster limit, and you would not be able to exceed that. And that was part of the delay of the settlement, and really kind of what the hangup was Judge Wilkins really pushed on the NCAA and their lawyers to incorporate some type of grandfathering in or something for the student athletes. And so the NCAA then kind of went back to Judge Wilkins and with a settlement that allowed for grandfathering in of rosters. And that was our biggest hang up the whole time, was just the roster limits. And not only for athletics and not wanting to cut kids that don't deserve to be cut, but also enrollment. And we're all, 50 kids is a lot of kids on a campus these days. And so that was the biggest thing. And so when the settlement finally came through, and allowing the grandfather kids in, our student athletes, that's really what made us feel comfortable with it. And over the past year plus, we had done a lot of work kind of dealing with our own financial situation and Title IX. So we were doing all this work required for the House settlement for very internal reasons, for our own reasons, and kind of setting a better path forward financially and other things. And so outside of the roster limits, we felt like we were ready to opt in. It was just the roster limits that were the hang up. So when the final settlement came through and we knew we could grandfather in, not only then could we grandfather those student athletes in, but then if you missed the date to opt in, you're not allowed to grandfather in. So actually the best way to protect our student athletes right now was to opt in. And the good thing is, I do think opting in is the right thing for us. I think it's the right thing for the department holistically in the future. But if things change, if things continue to evolve over the next several years, because these lawsuits are not done, we can opt back out, right? So there's nothing in a requirement at this point that says you have to do this for the next 10 years. But I do believe that we're here and we'll be here to stay.
Key phrase in that was roster limits.
Yep.
Let's talk about that because every sport is different, right? It takes different amount of student athletes to operate each of our teams. Grandfathered in, does that mean it's a grace period to get to the roster limits? What do the roster limits look like?
Yeah, initially no, right? And that was our pause, it was the roster limit and you had to be there on whatever date they said, which would have been ahead of next year. Now, basically what we can do, so I'll just use an easy math example, right? If the new roster limit is 15, pick any sport. If it's 15 and you have 20 kids on your roster, then you'll have to identify 5 student athletes on that roster to grandfather in. Now the NCAA would say, identify those kids that you would have otherwise cut if you opted in. Well, we would have never cut anyone because we were never going to opt in if we had to cut. And so for us, it's actually going to just be more kind of a genuine process identifying those student athletes. There are certain dates that the NCAA has put in place that they had to be on a roster, actively recruited before April 7th of 25. And believe me, we could spend 5 hours on the details of these rules, and I'll spare the viewers the details of that. But so there are certain restrictions that kind of show which of our student athletes would be eligible to receive that designation. And then the designation actually is owned by the student athlete. So once you receive the designation of a designated student athlete above that roster, so in that example there'd be 5 student athletes, those 5 student athletes would actually own that designation. And so what that would mean is, a lot of student athletes could view that as a positive because then they would say, well, I can go anywhere in the country now and not count against anyone's roster limit. And so then as the years go forward, We can't designate anybody else. If they leave, we don't get to replace them. So no matter what, in a 3 or 4 year period, we'll be at the roster limits allowable by the House settlement. It's not anything we can continue to beyond that, and so it's just a process to that number. But the biggest thing is we've protected all of the student athletes that are here and the ones that are incoming here for next fall.
So some of that's just going to be an adjustment of how you recruit and stuff for the next couple of years
Yep.
to balance out the roster limits.
You got it. And the grandfathering in, so, say in that example, you're used to recruiting 20 kids over a 4-year period, so on average you'd try to shoot for 5. Now in your recruiting strategy, you're going to be looking for more like 3 to 4 to balance out to the 15 in the future.
It's a big process. I know a lot of people were concerned about roster cuts for student athletes,
Yep.
and obviously that was one of your concerns as well. And some people want to know, what changes for the student athletes overall with this decision?
Yeah, honestly, for 95% of our student athletes, nothing. Absolutely nothing. And now things will change in the sense that we can rev share with student athletes directly now, and that's not limited to football or basketball, or it's all sports. And so we have the opportunity to do that, but it doesn't change our budget for next year. It doesn't change anything there. Really for the most part, it stays exactly the same. And again, that was kind of another thing that we felt comfortable with. I mean, you're talking for us, student athletes will have to have direct conversations with for their situation. You're talking about maybe a dozen. And that's a pretty manageable thing to do in a few weeks. As we continue to get into this and grow, and there'll be there'll be more student athletes that get involved on the direct revenue sharing side, but it'll be within the resources that we have and can generate. And so for the most part, though, not a darn thing changes.
One thing that USD and other schools our size have been really good at is giving kids opportunities with preferred walk-on opportunities and things like that. What happens now with preferred walk-ons? Do they become scholarship athletes? Do they cease to exist?
Yeah.
How does that look right now?
Yeah, I think, and there's no kind of silver bullet for that, right? I think that depends on each program and the coach's strategy within that program. The other thing now with the roster limits is basically scholarship limits go away. You're only capped by what your maximum roster is, with the exception, of course, with football for us, because we're still at NFCS, so we still have 63 scholarships we can give. So anything above that would have to be rev share in football. But track, right? Hypothetically, track's roster limit will be 45. I think Lucky has both of his rosters at 60 or above right now. So those student athletes are protected. It doesn't mean that we're going to go to 45 scholarships, right? Because we don't have the resources to do that. But by legal definition, we could. And so that's the ebb and flow of how all of this works. And then I think with the walk-ons, I think you're still going to see walk-ons get recruited. I think you might see some coaches stretch their scholarships a little bit different because there's no headcount sports anymore. So you can give in any sport, you can give a partial scholarship, whereas previously in a lot of sports you could only give full or nothing. Those are gone as well. And so I think you'll see a lot of coaches, to kind of increase the depth, they'll spread it out a little bit more. And so you might have walk-ons that are getting books or $1,000 or something like that, and then other coaches will still recruit the true walk-on, and they might recruit their front lines in depth a little bit harder and spend a little more there. But that's really going to be kind of the sport by sport and coach by coach, and we'll certainly give those coaches the freedom to work with us and do that. And then of course we'll be working on Title IX and all that behind the scenes, and that'll dictate some things here and there. But for the most part, we're in a pretty good spot there.
I know this will continue you'll sort out the process as we go with everything, but one of the questions that we had has to do with, okay, what happens to the non-revenue sports? What happens to swimming and golf and tennis and some of those things? Obviously, we're talking about roster limits, but are we concerned with opting into the House settlement that this could, in the long run or maybe the short term, affect the sports that USD offers?
Yeah, short term for USD, no, and I do think confidently, and I hope long term. I think that it will not impact those and our ability to carry them. I think nationally it's a little different perspective right now. I did some counting over the last couple weeks. I think we're up to like 38, 39, maybe more than that, Division I programs that have been cut across the country. I do expect that number to continue to grow. So the only thing that would really put us in a tough spot is all of a sudden we have a sport that within our region we have no one to compete against, right? But you're talking about a whole nother can of worms and kind of a downward spiral that we just haven't seen. I think within the Summit League and the Missouri Valley Football Conferences, these schools are committed to carrying these sports that they have right now. But don't get me wrong, we've certainly made cuts and adjustments, but ours have nothing to do with the House settlement, right? And this would all be true whether we opted in or not. And because just not opting in, you're still competing in Division I against the same schools. So opting in or not doesn't really hugely change the sports we carry very much. And in fact, in some ways, I think there's a lot of ways that we can be creative and help build some of these sports back up. But for us and some of the financial challenges and the situation we were in when I started here, we had to start making some cuts and changes, and we've done that. But we feel very good about our plan, not only for next year, but for the next 3, 5+ years, with the changes and adjustments that we have made to carry everything that we have. And I think once we can get through the next 2, 3 years, both for clarity, but then also building up our revenues and getting our fundraising going again, which we've certainly seen, that we're going to have a lot more stability in all of our sports. And so I actually feel good about the 18 that we carry and the changes we've made within those 18 programs to continue to carry those in the future.
Obviously, we compete in the Summit League and the Missouri Valley Football Conference. Is the decision to opt in, is that aligned with the other schools across both of those leagues? Was USD's decision influenced by decisions others made?
Yeah, all of this madness has brought a lot of us a little closer together. We're all talking a lot more. I think we're also scared that we're missing something, and the information's coming so fast. And I said this to you before we started here, but we're getting this in real time with everyone in the public. We're not getting week lead times. We're seeing it in the news when you all are. And so, but I think it's at least strategically allowed us to be a little more open with each other, and I think that's been a really good thing. I've said it a bunch of times. Obviously, the 3 Dakota schools, 2 Montana schools even, we talk a lot with, mainly just because all the ADs know each other, and we all had some kind of connection, before we got into these roles. So it's easy to talk to one another. But 2, our states look like each other, our institutions look like each other. None of us are private schools, right? We all carry football, and so we're just dealing with a lot of the same stuff, even though every state's a little bit different. And so those have been just good schools for us to come around. And then certainly within the Summit League and Missouri Valley Football Conference, there's a lot of, I think, consistency and commitment within those leagues to carry the sports that we have. The unique thing in there is you start to understand and hear the dynamics as to why Denver might be prioritizing certain sports and why St. Thomas might be, and where hockey comes in, and certainly schools that don't carry football or hockey and prioritizing basketball, and Omaha having basketball and hockey. I can go on down the list. Denver's hockey, gymnastics, lacrosse, soccer. It's kind of crazy to listen to all the different schools, their reason for opting in. I do think when all is said and done, I think the entire Summit League will be in. I don't know that. I know the Dakota schools are still, the other 3 Dakota schools are still kind of going through their own processes, and I certainly won't speak for them. But I wouldn't be shocked if that's where it all ended up. And some, reluctantly, and others, I think, more just kind of doing it because it's the best thing for today, and we'll figure out tomorrow. But I do think the roster limits and the inability to grandfather them in after this deadline is forcing the hand of a lot of people for sure.
We talk a lot about resources, financial challenges, some of that. So you start looking at all of the collectives and everything that we've been hearing about. The YATE Fund has been pushed a lot here, over the last several months, and that we heard about the Pride of the Western Plain, a third-party NIL deal. What happens to the Pride of the Western Plain? Does it still exist? Does it go away now with this decision? How does it affect that and the YATE Fund?
Yeah, so I'll start with the YATE Fund first. I mean, part of why we went away from the Howling Pack and established the YATE Fund and kind of this all-encompassing model was, I think, one, to just better represent our donors and their giving and support for Coyote Athletics in totality, but two, to kind of prepare for this. I think on some level we saw this coming, no matter what, in the next couple years. And the YATE Fund really allows us just to probably pull everything in. And so, I think that better prepares us to do that. So I think as far as the third-party collective goes and the Pride of the Western Plain, the most likely scenario, we still have a couple weeks to figure this out, and we're still trying to make sure we have all our T's crossed and I's dotted on this, but I don't foresee that continuing. We have up to $20.5 million that we can rev share internally. We're a long ways away from that. Our total budget's about $25 million, so we're certainly not just going to start sharing $20 million. And so I do think that'll shut down, and that's actually a great thing for donors, and again, why we went to the YATE Fund model. So donors that have been interested in supporting the collective and doing that, they have not been able to get a tax deduction. We've not been able to give points. Now they can just give to the YATE Fund, to an excellence fund, create quasi-endowments, Howling Pack support. I mean, all of those things. Donor money can't directly be used to pay athletes because that becomes NIL again, but that additional support can then put us in a position where we could potentially share ticket revenue and other things, and then have money to replace that through additional donor support. So the increased support, so people that have been giving to the collective, I would tell them immediately to start pushing that to the YATE Fund, and then I think beyond that, there may be a place for a third-party collective. I think that's a little bit to be determined, but if I was a betting person, I would certainly put it on not having a third-party collective at all, and then which is a great thing for the donors. It all goes to one place. It all runs through the foundation, and most importantly, they get the tax deductions that they so desperately want. And I think that was our biggest hang-up in driving big money into that, because there are donors out there that have wanted to do some significant things, but talking about giving $5,000 or $10,000 and being okay with not having a tax write-off is very different when someone's talking about 50 or 100,000 or more. That's a very different tax write-off, and so it's harder for that donor to just be okay with not writing that off.
When we start talking about NIL, which has been a confusing topic for so many people for a long time, name, image, and likeness, now we're talking about revenue share. These are two very different things.
Correct.
So this is going to throw another thing into the confusion for people. So NIL still can exist. Yep. With businesses, revenue share directly with the athletics department? Correct.
So revenue sharing is very, the things that we can share, the revenue lines that we can share is the revenue that we generate within the department, not donor driven, right? So, and essentially that's set aside then to make sure it isn't just whoever has the richest donor base has the highest payroll. And so there's some good in this that's coming as well. So the revenue sharing then, again, we can use ticket sales, multimedia rights money, concession money, things we generate internally, and the revenue sharing contracts will be direct with the institution and the student athlete. NIL, and there's a whole new college sports commission that's established, and within that there's a platform called NIL Go that was created by Deloitte primarily in conjunction with the Autonomy 4 conferences. That's basically being forced upon us, and this, again, not a choice if you opt in or don't, you have to use this. So if you have a true NIL deal, Anything above $600 must be submitted within 5 business days through this NIL Go platform. And that is designed to kind of capture this is clearly not a legit business deal. Those would be the ones then that even if a donor were to fund it, right? So if a donor says, hey, I do want to do some NIL, it's right pocket, left pocket, I own my own business, then they would legitimately have to make appearances at your business, commercials, social media, and have that basically generate the dollar amount that this NIL Go system would dictate whether or not it's fair. I think the overreaction from this is primarily from the autonomy for schools, and especially the Big Ten, not the Big Ten conference, but the Big Ten schools that can actually really afford this. And so you're talking about the Ohio States, Michigans, Alabamas, Georgias, Texas, those types of schools. Well, they've been building $35 to $40 million football payrolls, supposedly. That's not going to fly. And so that's their problem to deal with. We're not talking about that kind of money. Personally, I think that's a good thing. I'm all for the student athletes making money. I really struggle when we start to get into a point where a starting quarterback in college is going to make more than a starting quarterback in the NFL. Like that, and same thing for every sport, right? That's where I really start to struggle with where this has gone. Because again, now you're just getting into who has the richest donor base, and it's the richest donor base for football. It's the richest donor base for track. It's and that's not where I think, generally speaking, the country wants this to go. I think there's 40, 50, 60 schools that are doing very different things right now, and God bless them and good for them. What Nebraska is doing tomorrow is pretty irrelevant to me. I do care about what the Dakotas are doing, Summit League schools, Montana's, Idaho's, Wyoming, schools like that. I care a lot about what they're doing and how they're doing it. What Nebraska, Iowa, and Minnesota are doing, it's irrelevant. Completely irrelevant. It's a totally different game, and those are fights for them to have. I think some control on this is not a bad thing. And all our problems aren't going to go away, but I do hope and think that there'll be a little bit of a step of some regulation here, and I'm all for that.
So for revenue share purposes, the best way to help that is fill this place up on Saturdays in the fall and out throughout the winter in the Sanford Coyote Sports Center. And that'll all help, not just like you come to football games, it's not just helping football, right? That's a collective revenue share entirety of the department spread out amongst all the sports?
Yeah, I think I would tell people all the time, if your passion is tennis, the 2 best things you could do to support tennis is donate to tennis directly, of course, but then buy tickets to football and basketball and volleyball games. The football ticket revenue, basketball, volleyball ticket revenue doesn't just go back into those sports. Those are very much allocated through general funds. And that's why you see kind of the business model has shifted, especially in recent years, of the significance of having high-performing teams in football and basketball is because it does drive so much revenue back into the department, both through the ticket revenue, but then the sponsorships attached to that, right? For the second year in a row, we know we're going to have at least 2 nationally televised football games. That reach goes far beyond USD athletics. That's a great thing for the institution. And so many things are kind of built, and only a couple sports can really produce that. And I say that as a former college baseball player, right? Like it's not that I have favorites and I want to give everything to every sport that we have. But for us to do that and do that in a sustainable way, it's going to come through private donor support, and it's going to come through filling our building, right? And certainly in football. And then, you go back and you look at the history of our men's and women's basketball programs. Our ceiling's been right around 2,300, 2,350 fans, both men and women. And so, there's about a 500 per game opportunity there, and that's real money, and that makes a big difference. I'm not naive. We're never going to sell out the SCSC every year, every game. But, if we can get it back to where we're averaging over 2, one, the energy will be better, which means we'll win more. It's a harder place to play. But the revenue, and again, it isn't just basketball revenue, it's revenue to the department. The coaches don't control the ticket revenue. We do administratively. and that certainly showers over the department. And so, but that's the significance of why those sports have to win. We could have the best marketing department in the world and do all these things. If we have a 500 team, you're not filling it up, and that's just the way of the world. And so, and that's true anywhere, right? If Texas goes 6-6 in football next year, I promise you there'll be 20,000 seats open towards the end of the season, if not more. And that's just the way it works.
Yeah.
We're not filling our stadiums just because of tradition and, I love this place anymore. And we know we have those fans too, but you're not going to fill your stadium up without winning and winning consistently. It doesn't build year over year, it builds over time. And we've seen that. Our football attendance continues to go up. We set records basically everything we could set last year. We're trending to beat those records this year, but got to get off to a good start and keep winning, and that's kind of how the business of this is working now.
We've talked about this a little bit, but obviously there's the Autonomy 4, and they have plenty of media rights deals that are going to keep them in business, and they fill bigger stadiums and some of that. And then there's the group of 5, kind of in between us and them. So for non-A4, non-group of 5 schools, what appear to be the short and long-term effects of this decision?
Yeah, I think, interestingly enough, I would say, and I don't want to make a blanket statement, but you look at the schools like the 4 Dakota schools, Montana's, other at our level that you would define as FCS or AAA, so non-football is how they define Division I AAA. Our subsidies are massively smaller that we get from campus than almost all of the G5 schools. You're seeing, and I won't name any schools, but there's a few examples this year of, on average, your G5 schools probably budget somewhere between $50 and $80, $90 million. And you look at a few, the Tulane's, Boise State's, right? Like they're doing great and they're killing it. But for the most part, you're looking at a $50 to $80, $90 million budget that's subsidized well beyond 50% of that, right? And that's just not, our subsidy, and I would never recommend that we have a $30 million subsidy for athletics at USD. But to me, that becomes that range that's just so volatile right now. And they're all chasing, right? They're all chasing the one CFP spot and the money attached to that. And again, I think there's a few schools in that mix that have done a good job of separating themselves a little bit. But, I think I look at that as the biggest challenging group to me. And again, some of them, maybe they're prioritizing basketball more now. But, the ceiling for basketball revenue compared to football is very clear as day. It's not even close. And that's universal. That's not earth-shattering news. So I actually think, you look at the top of FCS, and I think there's a lot more sustainability to it. Doesn't mean we won't get into FBS. Doesn't mean things aren't going to change. But as stressful as it's been for us the last year, for a lot of reasons, and we've had our own challenges, and we all do, I think they're much greater in some other areas. And, it ain't all that bad here. And, does it mean we have smaller budgets than the Colorado States of the world? Of course. But, they have different models to have support from campus, but those are very different numbers too. And that's just not a place, I don't think, certainly not at USD, but I don't think other Dakota schools are really willing to go in a hurry either.
I know you mentioned the budget for athletics. I think it was $25 million. Is there a percentage earmarked that if you're opting into the House settlement that you have to share with student athletes, or is it up to each institution on how they can continue to operate effectively, plus share revenue with students?
Yeah, there's no minimum for sure. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that in the coming years. But there is no minimum at all, just the max, and that max is the same for everybody at $20.5 million. And I say this to donors all the time, even opting in now, the starting July 1, we'll be well beyond $500,000 that counts against the rev share spread, right? So we've been in this space and certainly a lot more last year than we were the year before. But we're in it and we're competing in it. And schools at our level, I would say the other Dakota schools, and UND is different because they have hockey. But and I don't know this, but my best guess is most of the Summit League Missouri Valley schools are where we are or beyond. In total rev share, I'd say most are 1 to 2 million all in. Again, I don't know that. I'm just kind of guessing on what we hear and what we think we know. I know for sure on the men's basketball side, the collectives in the top of the Summit League last year, the top three were like between $600,000 and $800,000. And so it's there. I know, football is anywhere from a couple $100,000, maybe up to $800,000-900,000 last year. And so, in our league, like we're in that space. Even now you look at women's basketball, I mean, Grace Larkins missed the market by a year. Grace Larkins would have commanded $300,000 to $500,000 in the market had she had one more year. And so there was all this market push and all this craziness that happened because the settlement was looming and agents were using that to their advantage. Hopefully this can crack down on some agents too. There's a lot of good ones out there doing a lot of great work, but there are a lot of really, really bad ones doing a lot of really slimy things. And I think those problems can continue to fester, and hopefully this will put a clamp on that too.
We talked about roster limits. I want to go back, though. One of the hot topics around here and everywhere has been the transfer portal, and USD's really used that in some of their sports here the last couple of years. How does this, with roster limits and everything, how does that affect the transfer portal?
I think it's at least gotten people back to the table to say, okay, with this new set of rules now, we really need to get some kind of, not control, but just some kind of cap on this, some kind of regulation, right? And so even in football right now, I think all parties are interested overall, from FCS to Autonomy 4 and everyone in between, are pretty interested in getting back to a one portal window. I think there's still argument over whether that's a January portal or an April-May portal. And we'll see where that goes. But it seems like most people are coming together around the idea that having two is a little bit crazy. Sure. We'll see where that goes, but I think that's pretty consistent then with the rest of the sports. And at least having, one portal season allows you to plan a little bit better. Once a 2 or 3 week stretch goes by, you know who you have, and you're not worried about another one a month or 2 or 3 later. So I think that'll be good. And then as far as just limiting transfers, the discussion's there, and I think there's interest in it. It's going to be a really hard one to put back, right? It's again, I would be very in favor of one freebie and then, maybe a cap on that, or if you do leave and there is money involved, then having some kind of buyout. But then the counter to that now is I have to have a CBA. I mean, it's, so for every solution, there's 10 problems. Sure. And I try to keep my mouth shut when I don't have a genuine solution to offer. But I do think there's interest in limiting the portal. I think limiting number of transfers and stuff like that is probably another conversation that happens after that. I think there is interest. I think there's also acknowledgement that that's going to be a harder thing to do.
Will the decision to opt in affect the budget per sport? Will we start to see budget cuts for some of the sports and some of that? And I know we talked about keeping the sports all together and everything that USD offers, but does that start to limit their budgets more, less travel and some of that? Yeah,
directly to the House settlement, no. I mentioned this before. We made some strategic changes and shifts, and we've been doing that over the last year plus now. So I feel like the plan that we did for our own internal reasons has prepared us for this House settlement. I think if you start talking about cuts beyond what we've already done, it would be more attached to higher education in general, right? If enrollment drops really hard, we're all part of a higher education system at the end of the day. And so if sweeping cuts go across campus or across the state of South Dakota, certainly athletics won't be immune to that. Now, hopefully we can generate enough revenue to kind of close that gap. But, I think as far as, what we've done with the sports we have, I think we're in a pretty good spot and feel good about our plan. And we've certainly got some work to do on the revenue generation side, but we're continuing to hit those goals, and we're not hitting them across, but where we come up short, we're certainly by far and away exceeding our fundraising marks. And that's a credit to Ben and his team. And certainly I'm never not going to be a fundraiser first. And that'll always be part of my DNA. So, but yeah, so related to the House settlement, I would say no. I think opting in, opting out, I don't think it would have made any difference as far as what we've done. And again, our plan is our plan. And, I felt like I kept kicking our coaches in the teeth for a year straight. And I kept thinking, this kick was the last one. And then sure enough, I'd throw a jab 2 weeks later. And, it was not an enjoyable process, and certainly not one that I enjoyed going through. And it's not the kind of news you want to deliver. And but there just kept being surprises and things some situations that we just kept uncovering that were unexpected. And so we had to adjust, but none of that had anything to do with the House settlement. It was just our own issues and kind of what I walked into 18 months ago. And like I said, I feel pretty good about where we're at.
Got about 3 more things. We've touched on so many things, but there's a couple more that I think are important. There's this decision to opt in. Who's behind that decision? Is it mostly you and President Gestring? Do you take feedback from the head coaches, or is this something that you just have to make the decision and then tell them, here's the direction we're going to go, here's how we're going to help you navigate this area?
I think, yes, we've definitely had conversations and involvement with our coaches throughout the year leading up to this. Generally speaking, I think the coaches are in support of it. And I'm not going to blanket for everyone, but I think a lot of the animosity towards it is probably more just the unknown. But I have the same unknown, right? There's some things we just still don't know about all the different things and the fallouts of this, and there's still plenty of lawsuits that are attached to all this. So I think it's more the unknown. I do think, above all, the coaches feel like at least now we know we're opting in. And we can kind of walk that course. And I think that's been the toughest spot for me and for them over the last year, is just not knowing. Are we going to opt in? Are we not? We didn't think we were, then things changed. But I think for the most part, the coaches are supportive of opting in. And I think that's pretty universal for all the sports. As far as the decision-making process goes, definitely not one that I'm just making unilaterally. Many conversations with President Gestring. I've far exceeded my weekly quota of phone and meeting time with her. There's probably been a couple months where we've averaged like an hour a day, just trying to figure some of this out. And of course, half of that might just be sanity conversations, trying to figure this out. But then even beyond that, the Board of Regents, making sure they're comfortable with it, understanding as much as they can to support us, and they've certainly been helpful with that. But at the end of the day, it's a decision that I have to make and stand on and live with. And for me, I guess I've always been comfortable with that. If I feel passionate and feel like a decision is right, and not just for one sport, but for the entire department, and certainly for our university first and foremost. I'm willing to stand on that, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and someone else will have to come in and fix it in 3 years, right? So, I've always been okay with that, but I'm very confident that this is the right thing for us. But certainly, many conversations with many people, our coaches, student athletes, SAC have been, we've talked with them through this. The biggest thing they've been worried about was roster cuts, and I told them that we weren't going to put them in that situation, and we haven't, and so that's been the biggest thing I've said to them. That's been the thing they were most concerned about, But it's been a long process to get here and a lot of conversations to get here for sure.
Another one of the questions I think are looming that people may be thinking about and maybe kind of forgot about. When all this started, we were talking about how much money this would cost USD's athletic department every year for the next decade, essentially, to back pay student athletes as this was pushing through. Does the decision to opt in versus not opt in, does that affect that payment? Or I guess it's not really a payment, it's more of a less money you're getting from the NCAA. Does that change at all?
It doesn't. So we were stuck with that, in or out. And so we have to live with that. And again, over the life of the 10-year agreement, it averages out to $365 a year, I think. Starts lower than that, ends higher. That doesn't change the South Dakota settlement that the attorneys general worked on. Help build a little reprieve this year. And I think holistically there were some good things that came out of that as well. And it brought some things to light that maybe were unknown. So there were some good things that came out of that. Was it earth-shattering to the entire settlement and change the kind of the equation with that? Not significantly over the long haul. It certainly helps as we look into next year. But yeah, you're not getting around that. We don't have that money. So they're going to just pay us less. And don't agree with it. Still don't think it's right. And would say a lot more vulgar things if it wasn't an email about it. But because it's just not right. But it is what it is. And so one thing I've certainly learned to get a lot better at that I've never been good at in my life over the last year is can control what you can control, and that's one I can't control, and we put our fight in, and I really appreciate the state of South Dakota for standing up, because it wasn't just standing up for us, it was hundreds of schools across the country, and I commend our leadership in South Dakota for doing that. We wish maybe more would have done the same. Not sure it would have had any different result though, and so at least now we know. And we can plan for that, and I feel like once you have the facts, then you just deal with them and move forward.
And that was the last one I had. You alluded to the lawsuit from the state of South Dakota, and we knew about this several months ago, and we haven't really heard a lot of updates on it, and people wondered, does that affect the decision to opt in or opt out? Does that change the lawsuit? Is all of that done? What's the status there and the decision to opt in?
Yeah, the South Dakota lawsuit is done. That was settled. Again, I think it helped save us some money for next year, right? And it helped, but it didn't help just South Dakota. It helped every school in the country, and it kind of helped bring some things to light with the NCAA. I also think it helped bring to light, not that they weren't aware of Title IX issues, but I think it kind of helped resurface those. But as far as the South Dakota lawsuit is done, it's done. And then I think the rest of it, as far as the NCAA being tied up in litigation and there being kind of a constant unknown in college athletics, is a long ways from done. I mentioned Title IX. There's already been, I think, I don't know if it's 3 different lawsuits or a group of 3 that brought a lawsuit and came together, but based on the back pay of Title IX. And so nothing moving forward, but how the revenue allocation is being back paid. Obviously, it's a football-heavy settlement. And so naturally, the Title IX stuff is going. And this is going to be the fight now of, is the revenue share by Title IX, or is it by the revenue generated? And keep in mind that the recommendation from the NCAA basically has been to spend up to 75-80% of your revenue share on football, another 15 to 20% on men's basketball, 10-15% women's basketball, and 5% on anything else. We'll certainly break that down. Ours will be much flatter than that. We're in a much better position with Title IX, and our Title IX report indicated that. We actually have some work to do to add on the men's side. We've been underserving the men's side, and revenue sharing actually helps us. So again, all the things that allowed us to do this and do this quickly, that was a big part of it. But I would just tell people, other than donating and not giving to a collective and giving that money into the YATE Fund in general, not a whole lot is changing. We're not spending, this doesn't change our budget a nickel for next year. It'll start to change it, come football portal time and things like that, but we already have generated more resources for that through fundraising to be better prepared than we were this year, as we were better prepared this year than we were the year before. And that's when things will start to change. But again, we feel really good about where we're at. I'd love to sit here and tell you the chaos is over. I think the chaos as it's been the last year is over. And I know this is going to cause some confusion, and that's normal. But we're in a good spot. I feel really good about the future and next year and beyond.
Well, I really appreciate this. I know we took a lot of your time, but there's a lot of questions, a lot of things out there, and I know that people really appreciate your transparency because we're all trying to figure this out together. You're still trying to navigate it, but the more that we can continue to share and educate, I think, is important. So we really appreciate your time and transparency.
Yeah, you bet, and we'll keep sharing it as it comes in because it's coming in every day right now. So, but I appreciate it, and appreciate all of you, and as always, go Yotes.